Webcasts. Today we are joined by Bernard Golden, who will be talking about cloud computing and security. Can't we all just get along? And I like Bernard's title because I have one that's just as fantastic, which is Bernard is often called the cloud guru. He's the CEO of HyperStratus, a Silicon Valley cloud consulting firm that helps its clients plan, design, and implement cloud initiatives. We're very excited to have Bernard with us today, and for more information about cloud and security, you can also join us in previous webcasts from the website. You'll be able to see webcasts from Jeff Jonas, Jeffrey Carr, as well as Lewis Shepard, touching on various points of security and government. Next week is the Gov20 Expo, which is in Washington, D.C., and we will be touching on cloud and security there as well. But for today, it's all about Bernard. So Bernard, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. And I see my slides coming up. I had a bit of a computer malfunction here just before the webinar, so I'm going to hope I can drive the slides. But if I can't, Catherine, what I'll do is maybe ask you to forward them if I can't forward them from my new computer. And so our topic today is cloud computing and security. Can't we all just get along? And I use this as kind of a bit of a funny intro in that, you know, it seems like this is probably the most controversial topic around cloud computing. And while this is not going to be a tutorial about cloud computing, but there's so many people who are interested in, you know, the benefits that it provides. Things like, you know, very quick provisioning, elasticity of resources, potential very large cost savings. Everyone's excited about that. And they get to the point of saying yes, and then they say yes, but what about security? And so we really want to talk about that today and talk about kind of best practices surrounding cloud computing security. And I've designed this so we have enough time at the end to answer questions, because I'm sure there will be questions or comments, and so we want to have an opportunity to do that. And really I'd like to see an opportunity for everyone to forward questions or comments so that we can explore them and so forth. And that'll give us a good opportunity to really drill down on the topic. So as I said, excuse me, cloud computing does have many benefits that people are very excited about. My own background is that I came to cloud computing actually through open source software, had done a lot of work with Zen, ended up writing the book Virtualization for Dummies, and coming out of that got introduced to cloud computing and recognized that it probably represents the next platform shift in computing, into the move to the internet or an earlier move to client. In other words, a change in the way we actually do computing. And you know, anytime that happens, it's extremely profound. Typically has dropped the cost of doing computing by at least an order of magnitude. I expect that cloud computing will do that as well. So let's talk about cloud computing and security. And magic, it did forward, which is fantastic. I'm glad about that. So what we're going to cover over the next 60 minutes is the new security paradigm that cloud computing represents, because it is a new form of delivering computing services, and there's a new security paradigm that goes around that. We're going to talk about 6 key best practice area around cloud computing. In other words, these are the areas that are most affected by cloud computing, the areas that you have to go take a look at and understand how to manage differently. We'll talk about techniques for layered and application group security. We'll be talking about this a bit more, but you know, the important thing to recognize is that security is a shared responsibility in a cloud computing world. If you're using an external provider, you need to understand that, understand the implications. We'll talk about cloud management and how important that is to automate security consistently, and why that's a deal. We'll be drilling down into the question of how do I take what can be very complex topologies, a remote location for my application to be running, a lot of complicated piece parts to keep ordered. How do I keep track of those and ensure that they're implemented consistently? The old model of things being very static and someone setting things manually, that world is gone because of this new world of cloud computing. So we're going to talk about how do you automate security consistently via cloud management. And then we're going to talk about cloud infrastructure and how that provides a security framework. Again, this is a shared responsibility we'll talk about. And as you go forward with questions, you can put them forward. I think we saw the queue and all that, and we'll tee those up. I think we're going to address those at the end. But I encourage you, if you have a question partway through, to put it forward. Laura will be keeping track of them, and we'll be able to go back, and if there's a question or a comment about some earlier slide, we can address that at the end as well. Okay. Just to tell you a little bit about HyperStratus, we are located in Silicon Valley. We're world-class education and consulting around cloud computing. That is our focus. We are partnered with two of the very leading companies, as well as other security companies and so forth. We have a relationship with Trend Micro, for example, which is a well-known security company. But we partner very closely with Amazon RightScale, and we've actually contributed to AWS practices and code, not to AWS because they run their own code, but templates and best practices with RightScale. We have a set of proven methodologies around cloud computing, and particularly around cloud computing security. And we focus on the 6 security essentials, the 6 areas that that we talk about as being the best practices. We will drill down into those in this presentation, and we'll also provide a way that you can get more information about those subsequent to the webinar. So with that, there's no question, as I said, security is the biggest issue slowing cloud deployment. It is the #1 issue, and #2 isn't even close. Really, when you start talking about cloud computing, the first thing that people bring forward is, it sounds great, I'd love to take advantage of it, what about security? The other issues, and there are other questions that people have around cloud computing, but they tend to not be brought forward nearly as strongly, nearly as emotionally as security. And this is a very, very hot topic. I'm the Cloud Computing Advisor for CIO Magazine, do a weekly blog there, which you can find very easily. And it's remarkable the comments that I get around my blog postings. And the most emotional, the most fervent ones tend to revolve around security. And I've had comments like, no one will ever trust an important application outside of their own firewall. No one will ever let any important company data outside their own data center. So it's the #1 concern. People are very concerned about it, and it's a hot button, no question about it. And as you can see, it's kind of symbolized here by the person clutching his laptop, which is, I've got to keep track of this. There's a lot of confusion. Who's responsible? You'll hear people saying, well, what does XYZ have, where XYZ is a cloud provider, Amazon, RightScale, Terramark, whoever it might be. It's, what do they present for security? How are they going to make things secure? And the implication of that question ends up being, well, it's all on the cloud provider. The cloud provider has to provide security. The cloud provider has to make my application secure. The cloud provider is responsible for it. And as we'll see, that's not really the case. And beyond that, there's really a lack of guidance or best practices. I mean, you'll hear people talk about it. You'll hear people say, oh, well, you could do encryption. But how do you do encryption? Or where should you apply encryption? Or how would you decide to apply encryption? There's really, it's kind of a lack of best practices and guidance. And, we based on our experience, based on our work, we've put together a set of guidance and best practices, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Interestingly, you'll hear many people say, oh, cloud is not secure, cloud isn't good. Well, recovery.gov, so we're very appropriate. We're in a Gov 2.0 oriented webinar based on, as a kind of lead up to next week's conference. And just, I think it was earlier this week or maybe last week, recovery.gov, it's not recovery.go, there's a typo there. Recovery.gov is now running up on EC2 on Amazon. They migrated this website that really talks about all the financial stuff revolving around the Recovery Act up to Amazon. And this is a quote actually, this is a quote that comes from the person running the system within the government, quoted in Information Week, where he said, the site security is actually improved by adding greater protection against network attacks and real-time detection of system tampering. And that's a very interesting statement that, the federal government has put the system up there and concluded that Amazon actually delivers better security in certain dimensions than was present in the previous method of hosting. Real food for thought there, and something that really is important to understand that, again, this is shared responsibility. Some of these things come from Amazon, and clearly they do a great job. Some of them reside with the application, and you need to be aware of that, and we'll move on to that. But really the point is that recovery.gov, they were confident enough in the security offered by a cloud. The thing that we fundamentally start with, talking to our clients, to companies that we interact with, when I speak at other at events and so forth, the cloud security truths. There's 3 elements that often get confused around security, and you'll hear people use them interchangeably, or they'll start with one and then slip to another. And it's very important to recognize the difference between those. One is security, second is compliance, and the third is risk. And let me start with compliance. Compliance represents the things that you have to do for your application to adhere to whatever regulations or legal requirements are in place for your organization. This might mean something like HIPAA. I noticed that we've got a question here around HIPAA. And so that's a compliance regulation that's imposed by a federal act that if you do certain kinds of data around healthcare, you have to handle it certain ways. There's no negotiation, there's no discussion. That's a requirement. That's a compliance requirement. And companies have these both from a legal perspective, like I just mentioned HIPAA. There may be regulations promulgated by federal agencies or state agencies or local agencies. And there can also be industry regulations that are not the result of a law or a governmental regulation, but an agreement among participants in a particular industry that this is the way we will treat this kind of data. You see that around stuff like financial transactions and so forth. There'll be an agreement around within the financial industry. We will all adhere to this this standard that we've put forward as a way of generating confidence in this sector. And anyone who wants to have confidence in this area has to comply with this industry standard. Security is the set of practices that you impose or follow to adhere to that compliance requirements, and also what other steps you might take to keep your application protected. Common example is antivirus. That's one everyone can understand. Put something onto your computer to protect it against people downloading stuff into your system, or you downloading stuff into your system that is malevolent. So there's a set of practices. Intrusion protection falls into this area, and so forth. This is a set of a combination of processes and technologies and people designed for protective activity. This is not the same thing as what you're required to do. These are the ways you implement what you're required to do and what you choose to do. And the third element is risk. And risk is really, what can I say, what's at risk if something doesn't go right. And this can be financial, which is somebody steals a lot of money from from one of your systems, or something happens that you have to make restitution for that, or it might be something less directly financial, but something quite important, like the brand associated with your organization. Certainly if your company gets known as being porous, its computer systems get known as porous and easy to attack, that's going to impinge upon the way people regard you and their willingness to do business with you. The other thing to understand is that in the realm of compliance and security, that is a shared responsibility between the infrastructure provider and the application itself. And in terms of cloud computing, that infrastructure is provided by someone else. And the application is really something that you take care of and are responsible for. So when you're using a cloud provider like an Amazon or a Terramark, when it comes to things like compliance, you have to establish, does their infrastructure meet the requirements for my industry? Does their infrastructure meet the requirements for my application? And that's an assessment. It may take the form of doing some sort of a checklist walkthrough with them. It may take the form of, giving them an RFI that they fill out. It may take the form of conversations, or it may take the form of them delivering you a document that says this is what we do. But you rely on their, essentially whatever they provide is what they've got, is what you've got. You don't go to an Amazon and say, what you've done is great, but I need X, Y, Z, so could you go ahead and do it? I mean, it's more or less that, they put it in place. They have that set of infrastructure that is designed and implemented a certain way, and you have to evaluate, does that make sense for me? Within the context of the application, then, that's things that you can affect and that you can put in place, and you have requirements around those things as well. We'll talk about those. But you have to make sure that you follow the best practices around security and also make sure that you're integrating with the security functionality that the cloud provider offers through its infrastructure. And I'll give an example of that a little bit further in. But the important thing is to understand that it's a shared responsibility. There are different dimensions around what commonly gets lumped in as security, and that in terms of risk, unfortunately, in cloud computing and most other outsourced types of arrangements, the risk is somewhat asymmetric in that most of it falls onto the application user or application provider. So, in the area of break-ins or something like that, typically cloud providers limit their liability to whoever hosts their application on their you need to understand that as well. And if that's a concern, figure out a way to mitigate that through insurance or something like that. So those are the key issues around security. You have to understand that there's three elements. They get mixed up. You have to understand which one you're talking about when you talk about it, and that it's a shared responsibility. Each party brings something to the table that they are responsible for. And the only way to get the best practice of security is to ensure that you've integrated and treat this as a way of getting the fullest amount of security possible from this shared environment. What is the new security paradigm within cloud computing? And this is really important to understand. And this is a kind of a trend in a way that's been going on even within data centers, is essentially the old model of security was, I'm going to really harden my perimeter. I'm going to put firewalls up. I'm going to make sure that no traffic can get in and out. And this fence that's broken down here really represents the new world. We have made much more porous data centers as we've begun to build systems that engage with our partners or our customers, our suppliers. Traffic comes in and out from our applications that we cannot necessarily stop at the border of our firewall. This kind of outside the firewall and inside the firewall has really changed. And so a new paradigm referred to as deperimeterized, which is kind of a tongue twister, deperimeterized kind of security has come into being. And that says, don't imagine that the way to get security is to really harden the wall surrounding your system. You have to really make sure that the security is in place at every endpoint within your application. Every part of your application has to have the appropriate security placed for its requirements and its capabilities and what can be put into place for it. And really important to understand that, because within a cloud environment, that is not your firewall, it is the cloud provider's firewall. And they make that available for all the applications in that shared infrastructure to go in and out of. And so you need to, as part of your security, as you go back to that circle that we just looked at, recognize what they provide for you to be able to create endpoint security, and then implement your own application endpoint security on top of that to ensure that your system, your application remains as secure as possible. And, just to reinforce, security is a shared responsibility. And this might actually be, I probably should swap this in the sense that really the cloud provider provides the widest foundation of security. I mean, essentially, as I said, they create the environment. They have defined how they create their functionality. the security services they make available that you have to take advantage of. And so they more or less form the foundation, the basis. And then whatever application management you put in place, should implement consistent and automated security practices. I can't emphasize this enough. In these very complex environments, when you build applications that are typically multi-tier, horizontally scaled, you may have 15, 20, 30 instances, meaning virtual machines, all cooperating to create an application. And when you get to that level of that number of endpoints and the kind of complexity of security, you can't really rely on manual configuration. It's too complicated. It's too error-prone. It's too easy to make mistakes. You really have to have something in place that where the mechanism is you define what the security is, and then it's automatically applied by your management, your application. Then on top of that, you've got to have your application. And that really, integrates with the infrastructure and the management security framework defined as your application needs it. Because remember, you may have compliance requirements that are specific to your application, and you need to make sure that you've defined those, calculated how those can be implemented through the services provided by the cloud provider and the management framework, define those, and then ensure that those are implemented through that framework. And so that's there. And then basically that's your security, the security of your application. And it might be the security for your users of your application. And that all rests on top of this tiered approach to security. So what are 6 crucial areas for complete security? If you're looking at building a cloud, you've got to make sure that you've got these areas defined. And this is using the Amazon defined security, but this has an analogous functionality within any cloud provider that you might use. Security groups and firewalls. Typically, you're going to have, rather than an external firewall that sits at the perimeter of your data center that defines what traffic can come in and out, you're going to be defining those kind of at either the application level or the individual endpoint within. And I apologize, I've got a call coming in. I think you might be hearing a little bit of a beep. That should go away pretty quick. The second thing is that key management. The methodology that everyone uses is that you have private and public keys to get access to these resources so that the cloud provider can ensure that whoever is actually accessing those resources has the right to. And the model that's been used is a public-private key arrangement. And so key management becomes crucial for this. Who has the keys? Which role do they provide? Do they operate within your organization? Which level of the application is it? Is it a staging environment? Is it the production environment? That would change. Where those keys are stored, and who has access to where they're stored. Those key management is really important. Network security is, essentially traffic into the application, between different components within the application and within the cloud. And so, do you have to do something like encrypt part of that traffic or all of that traffic? We recently did a project for a financial institution, had very stringent application requirements. For Amazon was being used as the infrastructure, as the cloud provider. And so we had to go through and implement network encryption, not only to and from the data center via a common, SSL type thing, through the browser and so forth, but actually between all of the components within the application. So when the web server talked to the application tier, that traffic was encrypted, even though it was inside the Amazon data center. Wanted to be sure about that. We also have storage protection, which is essentially, do I need to encrypt the storage as it sits on the actual disks, the permanent persistent storage? Does that need to be encrypted? Again, that same company that we did the project for, we needed to encrypt the data. And so how do you do that? And by the way, there's a set of keys associated with that encryption that you have to manage and monitor and make sure it's handled properly. Intrusion detection. Typically, the way this has been handled in most data centers is you have an application or maybe an appliance that sits on a separate box on the network and sniffs the traffic through the network. Within a cloud computing environment, actually you have to have this intrusion protection on every endpoint. So how do you manage that? How do you get that data, those alerts gathered from every endpoint presented in a comprehensible manner? Alerts get raised and so forth, and that's important. And then finally, the actual management of the application code. You're typically going to be developing code in your own environment and then uploading it to the cloud environment. How do you ensure that changes to the application functionality changes? And really crucially, security patches and so forth are uploaded and then applied across there as well. So those are 6 crucial areas for complete security within a cloud environment. And these are, again, there's a different set of practices than are common within most internal data centers. And again, because this is, this cloud world where everything's elastic, you might have large numbers of components of endpoints. You got to figure out, how do I ensure that these things are defined and then applied automatically through some sort of framework and not through someone having to manage them manually. Let's talk, we're going to drill down on one. We don't have time to go through all 6, but I will give you some information about how you can get more information about all of these different areas. But we're going to drill down on security group partitioning. And I'm going to be talking about, again, this is an example from Amazon, but this is very common. You'd see this in all of the cloud providers, maybe implemented a little bit differently, but the same sort of thing. How do I control what traffic gets into what ports on my individual? With Amazon, it comes kind of basis in a fairly secure way, in the sense that it has what's called a default security group. And a security group, you can think of it as being a software firewall residing on the individual virtual machine, individual instance. It is what defines what traffic gets in and out of that particular instance. And every instance comes with a default group defined by Amazon. And that default group is completely closed. It has no ports open. And it's kind of funny because I happen to see on the Amazon, on Twitter, somebody posting a tweet about this on the AWS hashtag, saying, I can't get at my instance. And what had happened was they had not opened up any ports. And because Amazon locks them down to begin with, the person wasn't able to get into their instance. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to add some ports that are open. Now, a very common practice among a lot of organizations is they overload the default. And what we mean by that is they take every port they're going to need open for their entire application, no matter which tier, no matter what functionality, and put all those ports into the default group. And it's convenient because you only have one security group, and everything's open. But it presents a tremendous vulnerability in that every bit of traffic can get into every endpoint within your application, and that's probably not a very good practice. And specifically, we'll be talking about this in the next slide, you don't want traffic into your web tier, which is coming from the outside. You have no idea what traffic that might be, to be able to get at maybe your storage layer or other administration instances. And so it's really important not to just overload the default security group. And if you do so, it's going to present a security risk. So a better option is really partitioning by the application role. And so one thing you'll want, port 22 is your secure shell. Remember I said, it's all based on keys and, being based on private key, public key matching, and that's particularly true around administrative access to individual instances. Typically, the most common practice is that's done by secure shell. And so you've got a, port 22. And what we recommend to our clients is that be put into its own separate security group, completely separate from every other security group. And a security group just have that one instance in there, that one port opened up, that security group. And that within Amazon, you can actually say, don't let it come from any IP address, but let it only come from this IP address or a range of IP addresses. And so you can actually define a security group that says, For port 22, only let it come from this IP address, which is my IP address. And then if we go to the rest of the application, you can partition horizontally across the different roles. So in this case, there's a security group in the middle column, and that security group only enables traffic in between the web layer and the application layer. So somebody can come in from the outside, execute something on the website. It can go against the application layer. But crucially, that traffic cannot get through into the storage layer. It is blocked from getting there. It can only go through to the application layer. And then another security layer is actually put in, security group is put in, to enable traffic between application and storage so that traffic from the application layer can talk to the storage layer, but cannot talk back out to the storage level, cannot talk directly to the web server. And in that way, traffic is partitioned so that you never have it never poses the potential for someone to attack your web server, which is the place that you'll get most of the attacks, right? Because people can come in from the outside. They can never get traffic from that web server directly into the storage. If they wanted to be able to attack the storage layer and get at data, they would have to figure out how do I get to the application layer, and then how do I get from the application layer into the storage layer. And that's really the best practice that we recommend with our clients. And this is really important. As you can see, these security groups are already getting a little more complicated, because if you imagine that not only do you have these layers, but you probably have other elements to the application. You're going to have things like, these other elements aren't represented here, but you might have management instances. You might have administrative instances. You might have reporting instances. And you're going to want to have security groups associated with those instances as well, so they can only get to the resources they require. And that resources that you don't want to have access to those particular instances can't get at them. So again, you'd probably want to have a set of security groups that would not let the web layer get at them, or something like that. So this is a better option, partitioning by application role. This isn't really the end of the road with this, though, because if you look at the lifecycle management of an application, you're going to have probably 4 or 5 different types of different examples or different systems running. You'll have a development system. You'll have probably a QA system, a staging system, a production system, maybe a load system. You might have 4 or 5 different stages of the lifecycle of this app. And the best practice is to define security groups according to stage, so that, for example, there's a rule in a lot of organizations that developers cannot access production instances. Only operations can. And if you've just use a security group that everyone shares, you can't partition it that way. But if you define security groups as being associated with individual roles that people have to have the right keys to get into, you can actually ensure that only the right people can get into these instances, and only the right, you don't get crosstalk. So you don't get a web server from a development system being able to actually access the application server for a production system, which obviously you don't want. Your security is probably not going to be as great. You have fresh code. You haven't really tested it fully. You don't want that web server being able to talk to the production server, and so you want to be able to partition that data. And so, and this makes the security groups even more complex. An application that we did recently ended up with about 60 different security groups. So as you can imagine, it's a lot of stuff to keep track of, and that's where a management framework comes in place. For that particular application, we used one of the management frameworks, commercial management frameworks. And what was nice about them was we were able to define the right set of security groups to be applied to a particular column here, like the stage column, just changing one variable within the entire management framework. So we changed one variable. We said, this is a staging system. And it automatically applied the right 20 or 30 different security groups to all of the instances within that. Very nice. Really important. And again, this is, you have to be planning your application, designing your application, understanding how these security groups or firewalls or whatever you might want to call them are managed within the cloud provider that you've chosen, so that you can come up with the right way to define them and automate them. Hope that makes sense. If there is something that wasn't clear about this, we have a question time coming up. So recommendations, what should you be doing? Well, you have to identify the application security requirements. So that compliance stuff that we talked about earlier, that circle, understand what are the things that my system has to do. And by the way, for those of you who are within federal government groups, of course, FISMA is kind of the key driver there. So what does FISMA require out of my application and out of my provider, and is it there? So understand your application security requirements. Understand, what security services your cloud provider offers or presents, because they all have a way to integrate with what they provide, the way that security is handled within their environment. Got to understand that. Got to drill down on it, and understand how you're going to integrate your application with that. Define the application security requirements, implement and automate it by a cloud management system. We run into many companies that have treated cloud computing like hosting 2.0. That's what we call it. So they've basically taken a very static kind of viewpoint about what their application is likely to be, the way it was in the old hosting environment, and migrated that into this cloud environment without planning for elasticity, meaning adding and subtracting resources dynamically, and without planning for potential failure of individual resources, and without understanding that you need a management framework to really manage and monitor all this stuff. And if you don't have that in place, you're going to be in a world of hurt because you're not going to know what's going on with your application, and it's not going to have the opportunity to dynamically and really autonomically address issues, problems, and so forth. So you're going to need a management framework around that. Integrate the application with that cloud management system, and then ensure the project management and IT processes reinforce this top-to-bottom security architecture. You can't count on one person to do it, and you can't just say, the cloud provider has to make it secure. Remember, we started this conversation with it's unclear, there's confusion about who's responsible. It's not just the cloud provider. You need to recognize that and understand that writing an application, you need to understand the environment and make sure the application is secure. So, you might say, well, that's great. I have a pretty good introduction now to security groups, but what about all those other things, like the network security and all that? If you'd like deeper information, what we provide is a free 1-hour walkthrough of the security checklist, all those 6 areas. You're welcome to contact us. We'll be happy to have a phone conversation if you're remote, or even a personal visit if you're a personal meeting. If you're somewhere in our area, we're located in Silicon Valley. And it covers all 6 of these key areas. It compares the way you're approaching security with the best practice framework. And I would encourage you to sign up for that. You can go to this URL and just fill out a short form, and it'll, we'll follow up with you. Or you can call this number if you can't wait. And I'm not sure if that's the last slide or not. I think we have a thank you slide. But maybe what we could do, Laura, is go to questions.
Sounds good, Bernard. Thank you very much. If you do have questions, please go ahead and add them to the chat room, and we'll go ahead and ask Bernard. Let me just follow up with a couple questions on some of your last slides. People want to know,
Sure.
What about mobile devices when you're dealing with IP addresses and
Well,
ports?
the way Amazon does it, and the way most would do it, is they would enable you to define a given IP address. So, one, you might say, well, I'm going to have to change that IP address as the IP address changes. And by the way, we ran into that with one client who had in their offices, a fairly small company, they had a cable connection. And every time they had to reboot their router, they ended up with a different IP address. So, and it's not that difficult to go in and change the address in a security group. Your other option would be to use some sort of a proxy that would have a fixed IP address, so maybe a VPN type arrangement into your data center, into your offices, or a location within your data center that would then have a fixed IP address that could then go back out to the Amazon stuff, or whatever cloud. Those would be a couple of ways you could go about addressing that question.
And then a follow-up, can other ports be assigned, and can the same restrictions be assigned?
Within Amazon, absolutely. You can define for every security group an individual port, a set of ports, meaning different, IP addresses. Getting a little bit lost here. You can define one IP address or multiple IP addresses. that can get access to that port.
Great. So another question was, you mentioned a very nice security management tool that you've used. Can you share with us the name of that tool?
Sure. We often use RightScale. That's our favored management tool. It's not just a security tool. It provides a lot of other stuff that really, if you think about cloud computing as being very elastic, where you want to be able to dynamically add and remove resources as load varies. It provides that capability. It provides the ability to use templates and so forth. It's a very sophisticated overall, what we would call management framework. And part of that, an important part of that, is the way it automates and makes consistent your security practices. Again, you have to define them. You have to design your application, and then you look to the tool to implement it consistently and automatically.
Speaking of consistently, how hacker-proof is that solution that you showed?
I mean, it's hacker-proof around the security groups. And again, remember, it's a shared responsibility. Amazon presents that, and so to a certain extent, you have to say, how confident am I that Amazon has created, bulletproof security groups? We're pretty confident, but there is relying on that. What I will say is that the best security groups in the world won't protect you if you leave your application gaping, or if you don't apply the right security patches, or if you don't, in other words, a great security group applied to your web server isn't going to help if you leave a login of admin with no password. So, it's based on a set of practices applied to that environment.
That kind of gets back, well, obviously to shared responsibility, which is one of the main tenets of this presentation. But I was kind of curious as to the double layer of security with the cloud provider and government or enterprise, whoever's deploying the solution. Is this a new way that for enterprise to be working? I mean, or government agencies? Usually people are so concerned about security, they only do it in-house. How much trust is actually there between the cloud providers and the government agency or the enterprise?
It varies, of course, and I'm certain that recovery.gov, they didn't, it wasn't like somebody said on a Friday, hey, why don't we try moving up to Amazon? That'd be great. And Monday somebody flipped the switch. They made an evaluation and so forth. What I do know about, in FISMA, again, for those people who are from governmental agencies, that's sort of a governing thing. It countenances infrastructure and application, so it's already got that notion in there. You just have to figure out what is mapped to where with that. I know that in this particular case, the recovery.gov is a pretty non-security conscious application. There's not a lot of really secret information. The opposite, they're trying to make it available as much as possible. So I think they were able to use the Amazon stuff. I know that other cloud providers, for example, Terramark, I think has gotten sort of sign off at the moderate level of security. I think that's the phrase that's used, which is a more secure. And a number of cloud providers, including Google, are saying they're going to build separate data centers to be able to higher levels of FISMA compliance. So
I heard that. Yeah, I heard Amazon was building separate centers down in D.C.
Right, and so the cloud providers are all aware of this, and they're doing that. In terms of the enterprises, again, remember back to that slide I showed with the barbed wire fence with the wire cut. This is kind of a new consciousness for a lot of organizations in that, in the past they've sort of said, we're just going to harden the perimeter. That's going to keep our apps safe. And in fact, it doesn't. But that was the consciousness. It was like, oh yeah, we keep everybody out that's bad, so we don't have to really worry about internal stuff. And that was misplaced even in the world where you had your own data center, but for sure within a shared environment. And that's not just cloud, right? That would be a hosting provider as well. I mean, you really have to understand that this is the move to deperimeterized security and work that way.
Is it possible that solutions that would actually be, or deployments would actually be more secure in a cloud scenario because you do have a double wall of protection?
Well, I guess, if we look at that quote that came from the fellow running the recovery.gov, his conclusion was it was actually better than what they had in place at the infrastructure level, what the cloud provider came forward. And, this is a controversial area. There are people who say, no, it can't be, cloud providers can't be. There was kind of a bit of a notorious thing happen about several months ago. The chief security officer for the state of Pennsylvania got fired. Not anything to do with some security breach, but he was at a conference and said the wrong thing or something. But in the coverage of that, there was a very interesting thing that said basically over the last 2 years, the funding for that security group, the agency that was responsible for staff, had been cut by like 50%. So you sort of have to trade off what is the best I could do with what I've got today versus what is the cloud provider doing, and they all I know are investing in very heavily in security.
That's interesting. Well, speaking of EC2, this is a rather technical question. Given that EC2 only recently, as of last year, came out with sticky sessions, and those sticky sessions don't support SSL, is a traditional hosting model translation of instances as load balancers and layered communication still working within this new model?
So didn't realize I'd be doing tech support here. There's other load balancers, and that's what we would recommend doing is using a different load balancer. And there's a number of them. So in that case, let me just back up. Remember, you sort of make an evaluation of the cloud provider security around what their framework, and then make an assessment. Does that work for us? And in this case, we look at that and say, no, that doesn't work for our application. We're going to use a different solution to replace that part of their offering.
And let's see, this the double layer of security with shared responsibility. Again, this would you necessarily have a contract that goes both ways? I mean, is this also sort of looking at the way that contracts are done initially, where you're not necessarily just buying a service? Is the cloud provider at risk as well? That if you don't secure your systems, then they could be taking the brunt of the security. And, for example, like you said, and perhaps that's not fair because if you're the government agency and you've run out of money and you've stopped securing your perimeter, is that something that's possible?
Well, I would say that the cloud providers, part of their infrastructure is partitioning among different applications and different very stridently, so that they avoid bleed over. So one application is probably not going to be able to affect the security of another application because of the way they partitioned their infrastructure. In terms of are they going to be responsible for something that you've done? Probably not, given, as I remember I said there was asymmetric risk. I mean, they write their contracts pretty carefully. And the level of influence you have over what they take on or what they don't take on in terms of an SLA type stuff or something like that really varies according to the cloud provider. Some of them, it's kind of a very fixed sort of a thing, which is really Amazon's approach. Here's what we provide, There's others who may be more willing to take on more of that responsibility, but it really varies according to the cloud provider. And that's part and parcel of what you should be evaluating when you make your assessment of which cloud provider to use.
Yeah, I was thinking too how bad it would be for the industry as well as uptake if anyway there was some kind of security breach and the publicity around it, not necessarily would it infect other instances, but just kind of that people are still tentative and hesitant to actually go full into the cloud, even though they've likely been using solutions like Salesforce for a while.
Well, or they've been using some outside hosting environment.
Right.
So it's human nature to be more fearful of new things than old things, and where we're at right now is people are going, this cloud thing's new. There must be danger, and I'd be really worried about it. Meanwhile, it's the same sort of thing. People get worried about getting hit by a comet, but they drive down the street without their seatbelt on.
Right.
Asteroid, I guess, would be the right thing. They're worried about getting hit by a meteorite or something. Not a comet. But behavior doesn't always follow extreme logic.
Well, actually, speaking of new initiatives, the federal government is actually launching FedRAMP, which is a program to have a single standard for cloud computing. And they're NIST is having a summit tomorrow to talk about cloud computing. So do you think it's possible to actually have an agreed upon standard or terms of service for the industry as a whole? I mean, when you think of all the different vendors who are actually starting to get into cloud and how much money could possibly be at stake, is it basically if you have to adhere to the standard or you can't run your applications?
I guess we'll have to see. I mean, there's huge interest and pressure within the federal government to move to cloud computing. That's very, very clear. The CIO of Vic Kundra for the federal government marching orders to everyone. Figure out how you're going to do this. I'd have to say that, but something that large, it's hard to see how it will. There could be one size fits all blanket kind of a thing. But we'll have to see. I mean, it's hard to see. Federal government is, somebody once characterized it as the Fortune 1, of IT. So, it's so huge. We'll have to see how it plays out. But NIST is, trying to corral this stuff so people don't end up with, there's 100 different cloud providers out there. I don't know what it is. I better just give up. I'll just keep doing things the way I've used to. Because the pressure is we can't afford to do it. I'm talking about within the federal government. There's huge cost pressure on how are you going to reduce your costs of running infrastructure. So I think that may be part of the motivation.
Well, yeah, here's the last question. What is the impetus for the federal government to move to cloud computing? Is the cost savings going to be the number one?
Well, what a softball question, huh? The federal government has something like 1,100 data centers strewn around the country. Wow. And, and that means, lots and lots of agencies and departments have their own data centers, multiple data centers. And it's, it's very redundant. It's a lot of extra effort, a lot of extra expense. It's hard to spread best practices or common standards across that many instances. So there's huge pressure to consolidate, and that's one of the things pushing it. There's also a sense that, we're into a new world of applications where, the loads are much higher, they vary much more, and you need infrastructure that can respond instead of, let me just use a very obvious example. It's April 15th and the IRS doesn't have enough computers. Their choice in the past was, well, do we just, tick off a lot of people who can't file their taxes, which obviously is terrible, or do we buy enough to handle April 15th and then have 80% of them sitting idle April 16th? Mm-hmm. So there's this, tremendous recognition that, the nature of applications is changing, and so we really need to look at, putting in infrastructure that is relevant and can respond to those new.
Well, thank you very much, Bernard. We certainly had a whole gamut of questions, which is fantastic. I think this is also probably a topic that people will have to understand and learn about quite a bit more. But the buzzword cloud computing is kind of is still about us, but it's actually a real technology, obviously, that people just need to learn about quite a bit more to understand what the risks are.
Well, it's the future for sure, and I want to thank you for letting me come and speak today about such an important topic, security and cloud computing.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you again. And if you'd like to catch our other security and government webcasts, they are on. You can find them on our O'Reilly Webcasts site. And again, we'll be talking about cloud and security next week at the Gov20 Expo in Washington, D.C. And I think that's about all. Catherine?
That's it. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, Bernard. You guys did a great job, which I expected, so I wasn't disappointed. And I want to thank everyone for taking part in our webcast today. I hope you have a moment to take our post-event survey. When you leave, it helps give us some feedback so we can improve the experience for everyone. And we'll also have a recording of this very shortly, hopefully today, and we'll send a link out as soon as it's ready. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to close out the meeting room now. Well, where do you download the presentation? Jamie, is that on the, will that be on the Gov2 conference site? I'm not sure of the exact URL, but Jamie just, you'll find it if you go to O'Reilly Media and go to the conferences site. There it is. You'll be able to find it there. So he just posted the URL, conferences.o'reilly.com/gov2webcast. It'll be posted there later today. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to close out the meeting now. Goodbye.